The world knew Ace Frehley as the Space Ace, the silver-faced guitar hero of Kiss, who made millions scream in sold-out arenas. But in the winter of 1979, alone in the basement of his Connecticut home, Ace was about to create something that would shake the foundation of the biggest rock band on the planet. What he recorded that night wasn't just music. It was a declaration of independence that Gene Simmons would call the beginning of the end. And when that cassette tape finally reached the Kiss inner circle, the reaction was pure shock. Because what Ace had done in complete secrecy revealed a truth none of them were ready to face. The Space Ace didn't need Kiss anymore. But before we dive into that explosive moment, if you love untold stories from rock's greatest era, hit that subscribe button. This channel brings you the secrets behind the makeup, the music, and the madness of Kiss and Ace Frehley. Now let's go back to that cold Connecticut night when everything changed. By late 1979, Kiss was the biggest spectacle in rock and roll. 4 makeup-wearing, larger-than-life characters had conquered the world with pyrotechnics, platform boots, and anthems that defined an entire generation. Gene Simmons, the fire-breathing demon. Paul Stanley, the star child with the voice of an angel. Peter Criss, the Catman behind the drums. And Ace Frehley, the mysterious space ace whose smoking guitar solos made teenage boys want to pick up a Les Paul and teenage girls want to get backstage. They had sold millions of albums, filled stadiums from New York to Tokyo, and built an empire on the power of spectacle and mystery. But behind the silver makeup and the lightning bolt costumes, cracks were forming that the world couldn't see. Ace Frehley, the quiet one, the guy who let his guitar do the talking, was growing restless. The 1978 solo album experiment, where each Kiss member released their own record on the same day, had been a commercial success. But for Ace, it was something more profound. It was proof. Proof that Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx could stand on his own 2 feet without the makeup, without the gimmicks, without Gene Simmons controlling every move. His album had outsold the others. New York Groove had become a hit single. And in the deepest part of his creative soul, Ace realized something terrifying and liberating at the same time. He didn't need the 3 other guys anymore. Rehook number 1, 3 minutes. What nobody knew, not even his closest friends in the band, was that Ace had already started planning his escape. And it would begin with a tape recorder, a bottle of Jack Daniels, and one song that would change everything. The Connecticut house was supposed to be Ace's sanctuary. Away from the chaos of Manhattan, away from the endless Kiss business meetings where Gene and Paul made all the decisions while Ace and Peter sat silent. Away from the constant pressure to be the Space Ace character he'd created, but was starting to feel trapped, inside. In that basement, surrounded by his guitar collection, his amplifiers, and the tools of his craft, Ace could breathe. He could be Paul Frehley again, not the silver-faced alien everyone expected him to be. It was there, in that creative isolation, that the idea struck him like a lightning bolt from his own stage show. He would record a complete song, start to finish, without telling anyone. No producer, no engineer, no Gene looking over his shoulder saying it wasn't commercial enough. No Paul suggesting changes to make it more radio-friendly. Just Ace, his Les Paul, and the raw truth pouring out of his amplifiers. The song itself wasn't planned. It came to him one evening when the Connecticut winter had turned the world outside into a silent, frozen landscape. He'd been drinking, which wasn't unusual for Ace in those days, but the alcohol wasn't drowning his creativity this time. It was unlocking something that had been buried under years of compromise and committee decisions. He plugged his guitar into his Marshall stack, set up a simple cassette recorder he'd bought at a local electronics shop, and just started playing. The riff came first, heavy and blues-soaked, the kind of thing that made your chest vibrate when you stood in front of a concert speaker. Then the melody, surprisingly vulnerable for a guy known for smoking guitars and space-age showmanship. And then the lyrics, raw and unfiltered, about feeling trapped in someone else's vision, about wanting to break free, about the price of fame when you're wearing someone else's face. What happened next, when Ace played back that rough cassette, made him realize he'd just recorded the most dangerous song of his career. Because it wasn't just good, it was honest. And honesty was the one thing Kiss couldn't afford. For 3 weeks, Ace kept the tape hidden in his basement studio. He'd go down there at night, pour himself a drink, and listen to it over and over. Each time he heard something different. Sometimes it sounded like liberation. Sometimes it sounded like betrayal, but it always sounded like the truth. The question eating at him wasn't whether the song was good enough. It was whether he had the courage to show it to Gene and Paul. Because once that tape left his basement, there would be no going back. Kiss operated on a carefully constructed mythology. They were 4 equal partners, 4 personalities that formed one unstoppable machine. But Ace knew the reality. Gene and Paul ran the business. Gene and Paul made the creative decisions. Gene and Paul decided which songs made it onto albums and which didn't. Ace and Peter were the hired guns, valued for their musical contributions, but ultimately expendable in the grand vision of the Kiss empire. This tape, this one song recorded in secret, was Ace's way of saying he didn't accept that hierarchy anymore. Finally, on a gray February afternoon in 1979, Ace made a decision. He drove into Manhattan with the cassette tape in his jacket pocket, his heart pounding like he was about to commit a crime. The plan was simple. He'd go to the Kiss offices, find Gene, and play him the song. Gene Simmons, the business mastermind, the guy who thought 3 steps ahead of everyone else, the demon who'd built Kiss into a merchandising empire that sold everything from lunchboxes to comic books. If anyone would understand the implications of what Ace had done, it would be Gene. But when Gene heard those first few bars coming out of Ace's cassette player, his reaction was something Ace had never seen before. The demon looked genuinely worried. The Kiss office on that February day was unusually quiet. Paul was out of town on some promotional appearance. Peter was nowhere to be found. It was just Gene, sitting behind his desk surrounded by Kiss memorabilia and merchandise prototypes, and Ace, standing there with a cassette tape that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Gene looked up from whatever paperwork he was reviewing, saw Ace's face, and immediately knew something was different. Ace wasn't the type to show up unannounced at the office. He preferred to stay in Connecticut, away from the business side of things, only coming into the city when absolutely necessary. "I recorded something," Ace said, his voice steady despite the Jack Daniels courage he'd needed to get through the door. "I want you to hear it." Gene leaned back in his chair, that familiar calculating expression crossing his face. "Another solo thing? We talked about this, Ace. The solo albums were a one-time experiment. We're focusing on the band now." "Just listen," Ace said, and without waiting for permission, he put the cassette into the office stereo system and pressed play. The sound that filled the room was raw, unpolished, nothing like the carefully produced Kiss albums that went through dozens of revisions before release. It was Ace's guitar, unmistakable in its tone and phrasing, playing a riff that was simultaneously heavy and melodic. Then Ace's voice, rougher than his usual backing vocals in Kiss, singing lyrics that were unmistakably personal. Gene sat motionless, his face unreadable. When the song ended nearly 4 minutes later, the silence in the office was deafening. Ace stood there waiting for a reaction, his hands shoved in his pockets to keep them from shaking. Finally, Gene spoke. "You recorded this where?" "My basement. Alone." "Why?" It was the question Ace had been asking himself for 3 weeks. Why record something in secret? Why not bring it to the band like every other musical idea? Why risk upsetting the delicate balance that kept Kiss functioning? "Because I needed to know if I could," Ace said simply. "If I could make something that was mine. Not Kiss's. Mine." Gene's next words would haunt Ace for years. "This is the best thing you've ever done." And that's exactly the problem. Gene stood up from his desk and walked to the window, looking down at the Manhattan streets below. When he turned back to face Ace, his expression was a mixture of admiration and concern that Ace had never seen before on the demon's face. "You understand what this means, right?" Gene said. "If you can make something this good on your own, in your basement with a cassette recorder, it raises questions. Questions about why you need Kiss. Questions about why you're splitting everything 4 ways. Questions that could tear this whole thing apart." Ace felt a surge of anger. "That's not what this is about. I'm not trying to tear anything apart. I just wanted to create something without a committee vote." "But that's exactly what makes it dangerous," Gene continued. "Kiss works because we're a unit. 4 guys, 1 vision. The second one of us starts operating completely independently, making artistic statements outside the group, we stop being Kiss. We become 4 solo artists who occasionally put on makeup together." The conversation went on for over an hour. Gene, ever the pragmatist, laid out the business realities. Kiss was at a crossroads in 1979. The Dynasty album was about to come out. I Was Made for Lovin' You was going to be their attempt to conquer the disco era. They couldn't afford internal division, not when the music landscape was changing so rapidly. But Gene also did something unexpected. He complimented Ace's musicianship, his songwriting, his raw talent in a way he rarely did. "You're one of the most naturally gifted guitarists I've ever met," Gene said. "But that gift is amplified by being in Kiss. Take away the makeup, the stage show, the mythology we've built, and you're competing with 10,000 other talented guitarists trying to make it. Together, we're unstoppable. Apart, we're just very good musicians." Ace left the office that afternoon with the cassette tape still in his pocket. Gene had asked him not to share it with Paul yet, not to make any hasty decisions. "Let's see how Dynasty does," Gene had said. "Let's get through the next tour. Then, we can talk about creative freedom and solo projects." But as Ace drove back to Connecticut, watching the city disappear in his rearview mirror, he realized something fundamental had shifted. The tape sitting in his jacket pocket represented more than just a song. It was evidence that Ace Frehley could create something powerful without the Kiss machine behind him. And once you have that evidence, you can never pretend you don't. What Ace didn't know was that Gene would play that cassette for Paul Stanley within 48 hours. And Paul's reaction would be the complete opposite of what anyone expected. The cassette tape that Ace recorded in his Connecticut basement never saw official release. It remained in Ace's personal archive for decades, a private reminder of the moment he realized his creative future didn't have to be tied to 3 other guys in makeup. But its impact rippled through Kiss in ways that wouldn't become obvious for years. Gene Simmons, true to his word, had played the tape for Paul Stanley. Paul's response was pragmatic and, in its own way, supportive. "If Ace needs to record stuff on his own to stay creative, let him," Paul had said. "As long as he shows up for Kiss, as long as he plays the Space Ace role when we need him to, what he does in his basement is his business." But that tolerance came with an unspoken understanding. Kiss would always come first. The makeup, the character, the collective vision would always supersede individual artistic expression. And for Ace Frehley, that understanding became increasingly suffocating. The late 70s and early 80s saw Kiss navigate changing musical landscapes, internal tensions, and the gradual erosion of the original lineup. Peter Criss would leave, then Ace would follow. The makeup would come off. The myth would be deconstructed and rebuilt multiple times. And through it all, that cassette tape remained a symbol of something important. It represented the moment when one member of the biggest band in the world proved to himself that he didn't need the safety net. That his talent, his creativity, his musical voice could stand alone. Years later, in interviews and autobiographies, Ace would talk about the importance of artistic independence, about not letting your identity get completely absorbed by a collective brand. He'd talk about the importance of knowing your own worth, of creating for yourself first and the audience second. In many ways, the story of that secret basement recording session became a metaphor for Ace's entire career. A talented musician who created magic within the structure of Kiss, but who always needed to know he could create magic outside of it too. The song itself, whatever it sounded like in its raw cassette form, mattered less than what it represented. Creative courage, artistic independence, and the refusal to be defined entirely by someone else's vision. Today, that cassette exists somewhere in Ace Frehley's personal collection. Fans have speculated about its contents for years. Some believe it eventually evolved into one of the songs on Frehley's Comet. Others think it remains unreleased, a private moment between an artist and his craft. But the real legacy of that Connecticut basement session isn't about the music. It's about the choice. The choice to create without permission, to validate your own artistic instincts, to prove to yourself that the talent everyone celebrates in you isn't dependent on the costume you wear or the brand name on the album cover. Ace Frehley, the Space Ace, the guy with the smoking guitar and the silver makeup, needed to know that Paul Frehley from the Bronx could make something powerful all by himself. And on that winter night in 1979, surrounded by his guitars and his amplifiers and his demons, he proved it. The fact that it shocked Gene Simmons and made the Kiss empire nervous was just confirmation that he'd created something real.